Welcome, everybody, to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. And, of course, as always, you know this, Smart Talk Radio is in your future, and this segment should be an interesting conversation indeed. We're going to be talking about a really interesting new work called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, The Untold Story of the American Revolution by Robert P. Watson. Fascinating story indeed about the HMS Jersey. We'll talk about that in depth. Who is Robert P. Watson? He's a professor of history at Lynn University, published over 36 nonfiction books, including the most recently, The Nazi Titanic, The Incredible Untold Story of a Doomed Ship in World War II. He's from the sunny confines of Florida. We are pleased to have him here. Robert, how are you, my friend?
Well, Warner, and thank you for your interest in the book and for letting me come on and chat about it today.
Well, this is a fascinating story, one that I would assume our listeners have not heard about, although when by the time we're done with this interview, they'll think, gee, why haven't I heard about that? Give us a little bit of a setup and tell us just a little bit of the premise of the book and how you actually found out about it.
Good. Well, I always tell my students, and I've written this for the last 3 decades, that there's more we don't know about history than we do know about history, that history still has her secrets, including some real whoppers like this one. Essentially, any school kid could tell us all about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride or about the Boston Tea Party, but virtually no one has ever heard of or read about this story. This is the single bloodiest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. There was a wretched, ghostly, rotting prison ship that the British moored just 100 yards off Brooklyn's shoreline, and they filled it with American POWs. And during the course of the war, the death toll was shocking. In fact, here's your statistic for the day, for the year, for that matter. Twice as many Americans died on this one prison ship than died in combat during the entirety of the Revolutionary War. That's from 1775 to November of 1783. So it was a horrific experience for them. And what the British intended was, after General Howe and Admiral Howe seized New York in the summer and fall of 1776 from George Washington, they used New York City as a base of operations to put down the revolution. And indeed, they would hold New York City until the very end of the war. What happened was they beat Washington so decisively that they had over 4,000 prisoners in New York City. And they figured the war would end in a few weeks, so they said, why spend the money, why take the time, why put the energy into building prisons for all these prisoners? The city had only 2 prisons at the time, so they converted a few Dutch churches. They loaded folks up in a sugar house, but they still had thousands of prisoners, and more would arrive, so they decided they would put the prisoners on these ships. So they did what's called hawking the ships. That is, they took the sails, the masts, the rudder, the wheelhouse. They took everything off the ship so it resembled a floating coffin, and then they filled them with these American prisoners, and that's the basic setup of the story.
So how far off the shoreline was this? I mean, it couldn't have been too far off.
No, they put it in Brooklyn, off the 100 yards off the shore of Brooklyn, in a place called Wallabout Bay. They didn't want to put it right near Manhattan or other parts of New York because they knew the ship was so riddled with disease that the disease could end up running amok and killing the British Army and the residents of New York City, most of whom were loyalists. They were pro-British. So they picked this bay, Wallabout Bay, because it was essentially a mud flat. It was a sort of a murky, muddy, shallow bay, and if you were to jump off the ship, it was almost like quicksand. It was that putrid. So they picked this isolated location precisely so that the disease wouldn't run rampant through the city, but they also at the same time wanted it to be close enough to New York as a reminder to the population. What the British essentially did with this ship was they used it in a very modern way, and that is as a psychological weapon of war. They told people, if you get captured by us, if you pick up arms against His Majesty, and you get captured, you're going on that ghost ship, and there's only one way off the ship, and we all know what that is. So the British assumed, as a psychological weapon of terror, it would deter Americans from picking up arms and fighting against them. And with the ship just sitting there off the coastline, and every day they had what they called the dead boat. It would row back and forth from the ship to the shoreline filled with dead bodies of prisoners. They assumed that would deter us from fighting. Of course, the wonderful conclusion here is that it had the opposite effect. Rather than cower Americans, it turned folks from neutralists into patriots. When the stories of the death and the torture on board the ship reached the public, people rallied behind the war. So that this ghost ship almost had the same impact during the war that the Boston Massacre had before the war.
So, question, there must have been at least thoughts or a possible plan somewhere to try to liberate this boat. Was there not, or was it just they thought if we try to attack it, they'll just kill everybody on it?
Yeah, there were plans. George Washington knew about this ship. In fact, several of his letters that survive are about the ship, and I reprint parts of them in the book. Washington was outraged what the British were doing, and he considered a number of things, including he sent an agent of his named Elias Boudinot with clothing, money, and medicine to beg the British to improve the conditions on board the ship. He ultimately warned the British in letters saying, if you don't improve conditions on board the ship, need I remind you that I am holding British prisoners, so I could respond in the same. But they also planned to try to break in and liberate the prisoners. The problem was, one, the British Navy was centered in New York, so the waterways were filled with warships. Secondly, the British military was based out of New York City, and General Howe had roughly 32,000 soldiers, which is a significantly larger army than anything Washington could field. Third, most of the people living around the city were loyal to Britain, so any effort by Washington, the locals would have informed the British. And the last thing was this ship was so filled with disease that if Washington's men boarded the ship to try to bring the men off, they themselves would have contracted the disease, and there was no way to sail the ship away because it was just a rotted coffin by the time they planned this.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to Robert P. Watson, historian. He also teaches at Lynn University a brand new work called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, An Untold Story, one of many of the American Revolution. Robert, what about, again, we can probably imagine this, but tell us a little bit about the conditions on the ship. Were people actually fed at all or given water or anything? How many people, how many prisoners were on there? And what about the people that were running the place?
Yeah, well, the British put roughly 1,000 Americans on the ship at a time. The largest number was 1,200. Now, this is a 1700s warship, so you can imagine there's not much room. So the men described that they were literally shoulder to shoulder, packed like sardines, and what was really unfortunate was for the youngest or the oldest or the weakest prisoners, they had to fight for a place to lie down. So in the middle of the deck, below decks, they had a tub, an open tub that was used for human waste. And it overflowed repeatedly, whereby feces and urine spread across the floor. The weakest among the prisoners had nowhere else to lie down and bunk but next to that tub. Needless to say, most of them died immediately by disease. The British were running short on supplies and food throughout the war, so they drastically cut the rations to the prisoners. The prisoners that survived this estimated that they were given about 2/3 of the amount of food per day that they needed to stay alive. So you can imagine just a putrid food that they could barely get past their nose. The water was foul. the British guards on board the ship would get their water from two sources. They would get water that was used for the crew and the guards from a stream inland a ways, but the water that was used for the prisoners, they just scooped out of the muck surrounding the ship. So, of course, bodies were thrown overboard, blood, disease, the bilge water. So just to drink the water or to cook food in boiling water was a death sentence. So most of the prisoners died rather quickly from disease. The guards were a mixture of some of the most sadistic guards were Hessians. These are the Germanic soldiers of fortune, the mercenaries that the British hired. But they also, the worst guards were folks that were called refugees. These were American colonists who had fled during the Revolution to British-held New York City, and they were outraged with the Patriots, so they wanted payback, and a lot of them were brutally, they brutally tortured the prisoners. There are multiple accounts of them driving the prisoners below deck at night with bayonets, swords drawn, just slashing into the mob of prisoners, and in the morning several of them would be dead from the injuries that they suffered the night before.
What kind of people were being held here? Were these a common thief, or were these prisoners of war exclusively?
They were prisoners of war, but the problem was the British never viewed them as prisoners of war. The British viewed them as criminals because there's no way to not be a citizen of England unless if the king grants that to you. So the British saw us as nothing but criminals that were fighting against them with illegitimate means. So most of the prisoners were sailors. And one of the reasons for that, the British Navy was arguably the most powerful Navy on earth. So they took it personally that we were trying to challenge them. So a lot of them were sailors. A lot of them were privateers. We had very few warships, so a privateer is basically a government-sanctioned pirate. We would get fishing boats, small schooners, and they would strap a cannon or two on board and harass British merchant ships. So when British warships blew a privateer out of the water, they were quick to punish these fishermen and sailors by putting them on board the ship. There were also some soldiers. There were also Spanish and French sailors who dared to oppose the British Navy. And there were political prisoners. So anyone that didn't take a loyalty oath to the British or was accused of espionage or disloyalty was put on board the ship. So it was used as, again, not only a psychological weapon of terror, but as a place of punishment and torture.
Did we have anything, the United States, or the colonies anyway, have anything comparable, even though not necessarily off the coast of London, off the coast of England? Did we have anything off the coast of what was the United States or North America that would be comparable to that?
We did not. One reason was the British blockaded almost every major port, and they controlled the seas. So anything that was at sea, the British could have easily, liberated. But George Washington, to his credit, treated British prisoners much better, vastly better than the British treated Americans. Washington sent a few letters threatening that, especially after Yorktown, when he defeated Cornwallis, Washington had thousands of prisoners, including officers and generals. Washington wrote letters saying, I will treat my prisoners and the prisoners in my custody exactly the way you're doing to our prisoners. But he never really followed through on that. He always tried to be a gentleman and rise above it. So there was nothing comparable on our side. What I would say, though, is the history of warfare, sadly, is just filled with very difficult and tragic examples of prisoners being treated in horrific ways. During the Civil War, we saw that at Andersonville and Georgia. We've seen that in almost every major war, from what the Nazis did in World War II to the Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners during the war. Just atrocious acts of inhumanity. So this is not new in that respect. It's just unusual for the Revolutionary War. We tend to think of the British as fighting a quote-unquote gentlemanly or a proper war. Far be it. The British fought total war and just were as brutal and bloody as in any other war.
Well, somebody knew about this, but somewhere, obviously. But Why is it that this story and the whole concept of this and the ghost ship of Brooklyn, the whole story of the Jersey, why is it suddenly now, 200 years later, that we know about this now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I scratched my head quite a bit over it. I was able to find several diaries of soldiers who escaped and lived to tell their stories, and they're gripping and heroic and shocking. It reads like any prison escape tale. And I found those at libraries. So I always make sure that I say a shout out to these librarians over the last 200 years that took these old manuscripts that no one had ever read, written by a farmer turned sailor that had been sitting in the library, the basement of libraries. They somehow preserved these for 200 years. I also found British war records. I found the letters of Washington. Ben Franklin wrote about it. Thomas Jefferson wrote about it. But I think the reason why it was forgotten was as follows. One, if you take events during the war, they oftentimes had a hero like a Ben Franklin or a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Paine, these very literate, impressive leaders who would write about it, and everyone celebrated their stories. Most of the prisoners on this ship died. The few that survived tended to be marginally literate teenagers. So as they went back to whatever they were doing before the war, nobody saw fit to listen to anything they had to say. Secondly, this is a day and age, the 1770s and 1780s, when people weren't encouraged to write their stories down, and there was no support, there was no understanding of post-traumatic stress, and it must be hell for any veteran or prisoner of war or Holocaust survivor of someone of that stripe to write their story down. So there was no support for these men to do it. Thirdly, after the war, we were a brand new nation, and we were happy to celebrate things like the Liberty Bell and George Washington's midnight crossing of the Delaware River. But we were more than happy to forget about one of the worst maritime tragedies in history and one of the low points in American military history. And lastly, if you go to places like Boston or Williamsburg or Philadelphia, there's entire city blocks in the downtown where it looks exactly like it did in the year 1776. Now, New York City has some wonderful historic sites like Fraunces Tavern or Federal Hall, but almost all the revolutionary sites have long since been replaced by skyscrapers. So it's hard to walk around New York City or Brooklyn and get a sense that the revolution was ever even there. Whereas one only needs to spend 5 minutes in Philly, Boston, or Williamsburg to get an overwhelming emotional sense of what it was like to live back then. So sadly, we forgot about these prisoners. We forgot about this horrific episode. And again, the bloodiest conflict or battle by far bloodier than Saratoga, Trenton, Yorktown, Concord, you name the battle, the far bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War, and one of the worst, I think, tragedies in American military history.
Yeah, you got 11,500 people dying on a ship. Not good. Next question is this, and that is the HMS Jersey. Originally brought here for that purpose, or was it just an older ship that it was over here, they didn't really have much use for it and said, well, how can we use it?
Good, great question. Yeah, she was launched in the 1730s, and when she was launched, she was one of the most powerful, sleek, and maneuverable warships of her time. Carried over 60 guns, multiple decks, crew of almost 400, a technological marvel at the time. But after 40 years of warfare and afloat, by the 1770s, she was rotting past her prime, and she was brought over during the Revolutionary period as a supply ship. So the British launched in 1776 the largest expeditionary force ever at the time to set sail from England, over 32,000 men, an armada of warships and supply ships. So the Jersey was probably filled with food, maybe even horses, powder, muskets, and she sat in the waters of New York just as a supply ship until they realized that they had so many prisoners they needed more room, and that's when the British command and the admirals decided that they would hawk her and make her a battleship. And here's another way to think of that 11,500 number, Warner. That's equivalent to the size of the biggest city in the country at the time. So New York, a Boston, a Philadelphia. So if you take that number in today's terms, this would be equivalent to the entire population of New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles dying in one prison during a war. So people would be just shocked and outraged at the death toll, as they were back then, although, again, sadly, we've forgotten the story. So 11,500 might not sound like a big number, but this is equivalent to the entire population of New York City passing in one single episode today.
So ultimately, the British surrender. What was the resolution, so to speak, of the ghost ship of Brooklyn, the HMS Jersey?
Well, they ultimately formally signed the surrender in September of 1783. November of 1783 is what they call Evacuation Day. The last piece of real estate the British held was New York, so the British packed up with their tail between their legs and sailed out of New York City. The other prison ships and supply ships, the ones that were too old to sail, they either burned them or they tore them into pieces and sold them as scrap. The only ship they did not either sail back on, burn, or scrap was this ghost ship, the HMS Jersey. It was so filled with disease. It was such a horrific reminder that what they did is they just left it sitting off the coast of Brooklyn in the stagnant waters of Wallabout Bay, and the ship was so rotted that without prisoners on board to pump the bilge water out every day, over the next couple of weeks it just rotted and melted down into the muck. And it was there that was lost and forgotten. So it had a really inglorious ending.
So is it sitting at the bottom of the water there, or is it completely disintegrated, or do we even know? Has anyone even tried to find it?
Yeah, years later, the Brooklyn Naval Yard, which is no longer in existence, but when they built the Brooklyn Naval Yard, they found some nails and some wood planks and some pottery and some things that are artifacts from the ship. And those are now in the Brooklyn Historical Society. One of the first things that I did was I went there, and of course you have to put on the white gloves to handle the artifacts because they're so sensitive. But yeah, they found a few artifacts. Unfortunately, there's nothing dramatic like an anchor or a bell or the wheel from the steering house that we could put in a museum, because all that stuff had long since rotted away or was hawked and removed from the ship years before. So it's been reduced to a nail, a little piece of wood, a broken piece of pottery, and that's about it. As to the 11,500 plus men that died, each morning they would open up the hatches that they nailed down at night, and the British guards would yell the same thing every morning: "Rebels, bring up your dead." And between 6 and 12 people per night would die on average below deck, and they'd carry them up, and then the prisoners would be forced to row them ashore, and under a British armed guard, they would bury them. And the prisoners that survived wrote that it was just a shallow pit in the sand, and they would throw the bodies in, and they would be allowed to shovel 1 to 3 shovelfuls of sand over the bodies before the guards would shove them back on the boat and head back to their floating prison. So the dead, their bones were picked apart, picked over by buzzards. Other prisoners recall peeking through the portholes and seeing wild dogs, coyotes, and pigs eating the dead, and then whenever the tide was high, the bones would be washed out to sea and lost forever. So there are a few bones in a vault in Brooklyn at Fort Greene Park, and just a handful of destroyed artifacts at the Brooklyn Historical Society. Other than that, she's gone.
Well, thanks to people like you, it will not be forgotten and actually probably resurrected, so to speak. A fascinating story. The work is called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, An Untold Story of the American Revolution by Robert P. Watson, all about the HMS Jersey, a prison ship off the coast of New York City. And Robert, fascinating work indeed. What's your next project?
I'm working on a book now on two of them, actually. One on George Washington's role in picking the capital city and how after the war he pretty much took the bull by the horns. And then I'm working on an autobiography, a memoir on Francis Scott Key, a biography of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem.
Yes, he did. That's a fascinating story, that whole thing. But
it sure is.
We'll look forward to having you back on again. How can people pick up a copy of the book and find out about some of the other writings you've done?
The Ghost Ship Brooklyn is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's on audiobook, e-book, hardback, you name it. It's in other languages. Or I have two websites. One is ghostshipofbrooklyn.com. The other one is robertwatson.net. And they're all listed there.
Well, thanks so much again for your time. Congrats on the book. And again, we'd like to have you on again sometime.
It would be my pleasure. I appreciate your interest in it, and good luck with the program.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.